It's interesting, to me at least, how it seems to be the case that science is finally catching up with the importance of stories in people's lives, the importance of fiction, and the importance of the imagination as an evolved and adaptive mechanism that allows people to travel in time within their minds. You know, we can travel to the past and revisit events. We can travel into different futures. We can imagine alternative scenarios all within our minds. We can adopt the perspectives of other people, the foundation of empathy, using our imagination. And we can simulate. We can imagine what things are like. And that ability to simulate and to construct what-if scenarios may be the coolest thing about humans. You know, forget about opposable thumbs and stereoscopic vision and things like that. Imagination, that's the cool thing. That's what probably has allowed us to achieve global dominance as a species. Compared to other primates, we're really not very impressive. I think a chimp could take out 5, 6 big guys. But we have the imagination, which is a huge advantage for us. And given the importance of imagination, it is I want to say unspeakable. I don't mean that in the Lovecraftian sense. I mean it in the sense where I can't find words that are strong enough. But it's an unspeakable pleasure to me to be able to invite somebody who, in my maybe idiosyncratic, but also I think fairly qualified opinion, is the most exciting writer of imaginative fiction in his generation. And that's Joe Hill. And when I told my colleagues in the Recreational Fear Lab that Joe Hill was coming, people were very excited. And some people also asked for recommendations. What should I read? And you know, one guy I know, he's interested in moral psychology. So I said, well, you got to read Horns. Somebody else wanted something scary, but also not too depressing. I think her life was like this, and she wanted it to be like this for a few hours. So I said, okay, you go for Heart-Shaped Box. Somebody wanted their mind blown, you know, piecemeal. And so I said, you know, one of the collections, Full Throttle maybe, Strange Weather. And then if you're not completely mind blown, go for 20th Century Ghosts. Somebody's into post-apocalyptic sci-fi epic stuff, you know, read The Fireman. So there really is somebody for everybody, something for everybody. And that's the mark of a very versatile writer who is able to construct virtual, imaginative worlds that are very often full of horror, but that are also full of humanity and compassion. And apart from being a very accomplished writer and a very versatile writer, Joe Hill also has some really interesting thoughts about scary stuff. And so that's one reason why we invited him here today. And we're very grateful that you agreed to come to talk about living in fear, the art of horror. So let's give Joe Hill a hand. Can I put this on?
High enough, you think? Higher? Here?
AV guy?
What do you think?
We can make it bump it.
Put it there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mathias, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, but I'm a little bit worried that this keynote speech ends with my decapitated head in a freezer.
It might.
Yeah. Hey guys, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for coming. I want to sincerely thank Aarhus University for inviting me to be a part of the Third Annual Workshop on Recreational Fear. I also want to express my gratitude to Mathias, who dreamed this whole thing up. If dream is the word I'm looking for, and I'm not sure it is, maybe nightmare is more apt, although at least in English nightmare isn't a verb. You can't nightmare something into existence, can you? I hope not. But I digress. I read Mathias's 2017 book Why Horror Seduces around the time it came out and was blown away. I thought then, and I think now, that it's the wisest and most elegantly argued study of the genre in decades, maybe going all the way back to a book called Danse Macabre. I've been an admirer ever since, and when I was invited to come to Aarhus, I couldn't say no. How am I doing with the pronunciation? Is Aarhus? Yeah?
It's okay.
I've long wanted to see firsthand some of the work Mathias has been doing here in the Recreational Fear Lab. Dr. Clasen, I'm in your debt. Usually when I stand up in front of a crowd, it's to sell a book, and I have a practiced shtick, a performance I can deliver from memory. But I felt that this event called for something different, that something else, something more is required when one is going to deliver a keynote speech to an academic conference. So I thought I might say something about my life in the fear business, how I came to write some of my own scary tales, and what I've learned about the art and craft of scaring the shit out of people. We better begin by addressing the white elephant in the room. That's the wrong term again. It's important to acknowledge not the white elephant in the room, but the boogeyman in the closet. The boogeyman in question is actually America's boogeyman, and has been since Alfred Hitchcock died, I guess. My dad's first novel, Carrie, came out in 1974, and in the following year it sold 1 million copies. The horror genre has never been the same since. I remember when I was a little kid, my mother took me to a bookstore and I saw a poster with my dad's face on it, advertising an upcoming appearance. I turned to my mom and said, "Dad has to go be Stephen King next month." My dad has been in the business of being Stephen King for half a century now, and has always had a gleeful relationship with the horror genre. His delight in stories that unnerve and unsettle is contagious. There was never any chance I was going to come out of that childhood and not love John Carpenter films, Richard Matheson novels, and Edward Gorey cartoons. But my own fascination with the art of frightening people, that began in a very concrete, very unusual way when I was 9 years old. And yes, my dad is to blame. In 1981, he and his friend George Romero went to Pittsburgh to make a film. It was called Creepshow, and it was a love letter to the gory American horror comics of the 1950s, comics that nearly went extinct after a series of hostile congressional hearings based on the junk science of psychiatrist and committed Freudian Frederick Wertham. My dad took a part in Creepshow as a country hick named Jordy Verrill, who turns into a gross pile of walking, talking moss. And they cast me in the movie as well. I played Billy, a boy who loves horror comics and who uses a voodoo doll to torture his father. Tom Atkins in the film, after the old bastard throws away his comic collection. In those days, the rules about working with child actors were close to non-existent. There was no on-set tutor or nanny. Instead, George Romero asked Tom Savini to look after me while my dad was busy. You may have heard of Tom Savini, also sometimes known as the godfather of gore. Savini came back from Vietnam, where he was a combat photographer, snapping pictures of people who had been blown to pieces, and he turned his trauma into art. He taught himself the skills of special makeup effects, and soon made himself a master of Technicolor carnage. In short order, Tom was the acknowledged master of the craft, and he left a shocking trail of bloody mayhem across horror classics like Dawn of the Dead and Friday the 13th. Tom was my first rock star. He wore biker boots and a leather jacket and had sculpted eyebrows like Spock on Star Trek. I spent a week in his trailer watching him sculpt monsters and artfully disfigure movie stars. He let me wear the big claws of the shaggy beast that kills Adrienne Barbeau midway through the film. I must have spent days in those things, wearing them like gloves, growling and swiping at anyone who came close to my hiding place under Tom's workbench. I scared a couple of people and scared them good, lunging out at them like a feral chimpanzee. That was where I discovered what a pleasure it could be to jolt a happy scream out of someone. I don't think Tom Savini knew many kids, and he talked to me the way he would have talked to an adult. When I wanted to look at a book of autopsy photos, he got it down for me, and we examined them together. I was at that peculiar moment in childhood when death is simply another natural phenomenon worthy of one's consideration. I saw right away that dead bodies are empty suitcases. The stuff that was packed inside them is gone. And that emptiness, that's the part of death that frightens us, that unknowable nothing. So I fell in love with Tom Savini's work, and I knew by the time I left the Creepshow soundstage what I wanted to do with my life. I, too, wanted to slaughter people in creative ways and invent horrible stomach-turning monsters. And in fact, that is what I wound up doing for a living. I just do it on paper instead of with latex appliances and fake blood. Around the same time I appeared in Creepshow, the EC horror comics, the very comics that inspired the movie, came back from the dead. It's hard to keep a good ghoul down. And they were reprinted in beautiful, oversized, hardcover editions, and my dad collected them all. Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, and of course the most famous of them, Tales from the Crypt. Frederick Wortham warned parents in the 1950s that those comics would warp small children and fill their heads with deranged ideas. And he was right. He was wrong about almost everything else, but not wrong about that. EC's horror stories held me entranced, had lost none of their goofy, gory power in the years since they were hounded off the magazine stands. I read them and read them again. I dreamt about them. And I dreamt about the zombies from Dawn of the Dead, a movie we had on VHS and which I watched perhaps 20 times in 2 years. And there was one other thing that came into my life in my early teens and which shaped my enthusiasm for tales of terror. I had friends who loved rock and roll and who obsessed over every issue of Rolling Stone magazine. I knew other kids who loved the Boston Celtics and the Red Sox and who never missed an issue of Sports Illustrated. The only magazine I cared about was Fangoria, Fango to the faithful. Fango covered everything horror, all the forthcoming movies, the nastier the better, and all the latest books. It explored gross-out special effects in detail and made stars out of guys like Tom Savini, Rob Bottin, and Rick Baker. It's important to mention Fangoria because of the way it ever so slightly rewired my brain and changed my response to horror films. See, normally, when someone watches a scary movie, they jump and shout when a rotting hand comes out from under the bed to grab the heroine's ankle. But Fangoria always brought you inside the making of a scary moment. You were under the bed with the creature. You were in on the scare. You were wearing the furry monster gloves. There was delight in that, and power. People wanted to be scared. They paid money to be scared, and scared well. If you had a certain kind of artistic temperament and the right set of skills, they just might pay you. How exciting is that? And to be able to pluck at their nerve endings the way a musician plucks the strings of a banjo, that felt exciting, a weird honor and privilege. Horror artists are musicians, after all. They play the human nervous system until it produces a tuneful series of screams. Of course, in a sense, I didn't need Fangoria to tell me people were making a good living in the fear trade. I knew what paid for the '57 Chevy in the driveway and the beer in the fridge. Like a lot of people here, I fell in love with Stephen King novels in the 1980s, and I've been in love with them ever since. My first encounter with grown-up fiction was my father's collaboration with Peter Straub, The Talisman. Not long after that, I read a third draft of It, burning through a manuscript so massive it came halfway to my knee when I set it on the floor next to my bed. I read Peter's Ghost Story, too, right around the same period. Reading that novel was when I realized for the first time that someday there was going to be less of my life ahead of me than there was behind me. Someday would be my last day. When I first fell in love with horror, I fell in love with a pair of furry monster gloves borrowed from Tom Savini. In time, I came to see horror itself as another pair of gloves, the sort that come lined with lead, and which you can use to safely pick up and examine certain nearly radioactive truths about mortality, about pain, about suffering, about predation and survival. I talk sometimes about the metaphor of the vampire. No one will ever have to fight off a vampire. None of us here will ever be visited on a nightly basis by a creature that wants to drain the life out of us, one blood-sucking bite at a time. But people do face difficult, life-threatening illness. Someday you might find yourself staring down the barrel of a cancer diagnosis, and then you're in the fight of your life with an invisible enemy that wants to rob you of your strength and vitality. That's a scary thing to think about. But vampire stories offer a playground of the mind, an imaginary space in which one can examine that idea, that dreadful possibility, in a safe, even pleasurable way. The vampire story becomes a place for rehearsal and exploration. Now, I didn't know that consciously for a long time, never articulated that to myself. It wasn't until I was in my 40s and read Why Horror Seduces, in fact, that someone pulled that all together for me, that the enjoyment of horror fiction had a healthy psychological function, was a way to prepare for and make sense of real-life shocks. I began to write every day when I was 13, and I wrote several books in high school, bad ones. It seemed like a normal thing to do, to get back from school and sit in front of my typewriter and play make-believe for an hour or so. That's what my parents were usually doing when I returned from my classes. In college, I began to get serious about the idea of being published. I was insecure and had a fear that if I wrote as Joseph King, some unscrupulous publisher would put out a lousy novel just to make a few bucks off my connection to a famous writer. So I began to write as Joe Hill. For a while, I also made an effort to write what is called in America mainstream fiction, stories of marital affairs, divorce, difficult children. Those stories had some technical polish, but weren't much fun. I never read that kind of stuff, and even now I'm not sure why I thought I had to write that kind of fiction. I never read The New Yorker. I was still a subscriber to Fangoria magazine. In the early going, I tried to avoid writing horror because I felt like Joseph King, the son of Stephen King, ought to find his own material. But Joe Hill, he was no one or anyone. He could do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was to put Tom Savini's furry gloves back on and start scaring screams out of people. No, I'm being glib. I wrote under a pen name because I was a naturally anxious guy. I gravitated toward horror for the same reason. Those mainstream stories I attempted, they were boring. I'm sure people were bored reading them. I was bored writing them. How could I keep the reader reading? That was a problem that began to obsess me. After a few hundred rejections, it began to seem like the most important thing in the world. How did one keep the reader's attention nailed to the page? My answer was peril. George Lucas once said it's easy to get the audience involved. Take a little kitten and have some guy wring its neck. I needed to get a hand on the throat of the reader, a claw on their ankle. My own fears fascinated me, and I came to believe they would fascinate the reader as well. I believed if a man found himself sitting in the dark of an old movie theater with the ghost of a dead girl sharing his popcorn, the reader would want to know what happened next. I began to do terrible things to people, fictional people. In one story, a kidnapped child found himself in a killer's basement with a disconnected antique phone. Only sometimes the phone still rang with calls from one of the madman's other victims. In another story, an abused and angry teenager wakes up, like Gregor Samsa, to discover he's become a giant insect. But unlike Samsa, he's overjoyed by the metamorphosis and uses his new form to slaughter his schoolmates. That story, You Will Hear the Locusts Sing, began as a homage to the giant insect movies of the 1950s and ended as a comment on the Columbine massacre. I wrote about the sons of Van Helsing who make a brave stab to resist joining the family business. The Van Helsing boys were made of stronger stuff than I was. I learned I liked the family business just fine. Writing about peril, intense, worst-case scenario peril, was an adaptation to the brutal challenge of carving out a space for myself in the harsh environment of 21st century publishing. But now, looking back from a distance of nearly 20 years, it strikes me that almost all good fiction is concerned with peril, and that we do in fact read for our own survival. The peril need not be mortal, it may be moral, or financial, or romantic. My advice to young writers is, put something precious at risk as soon as possible, in the first sentence of your story, if possible. Certainly before the end of the first chapter. Get a hand on the kitten's neck and you'll get a hand on the reader's throat. This is in fact why we read, to face peril without facing it, to imagine the worst without having to live it every day, to wrestle with the heartrending horrors of marrying the wrong person, or spending 20 years in the wrong job, or facing off a horde of hungry, rabid giant rats, which, let's face it, could also happen. Oh good, a couple people laughed. And the thing I remember best about Creepshow was that George Romero laughed all the time. So did my dad. When they watched Tom Savini demonstrate a disgusting new effect, like when a few hundred live cockroaches began boiling out of a dead man's mouth, they erupted into gales of laughter. I often went to scary movies with my father and my father's friends and soon noticed something. Whenever there was a jump scare, the whole theater would shriek, except for my dad and his gang of horror-writing friends, who almost always responded with laughter. Then I noticed something else. Most of the time I was laughing with them. Fangoria magazine and my affection for horror fiction had brought me in on the joke. As an adult, I discovered that there was almost always a good story of horror and wonder in anything that made me laugh. Andy Warhol made famous a style of art known as pop art. I was thinking about that phrase, pop art, one day and thought, what if you did? What if you popped art? And I laughed. And then I wrote a story about an inflatable boy named Arthur Roth, who's made out of plastic and weighs 6 ounces, and if he sat in a sharpened pencil, it would kill him. And it's still one of my very best short stories. I wrote that one when I was 30, and it's been all downhill since then. There's a whole branch of study that explores why we laugh, why we are startled into these uncontrollable vocalizations that are so like screams. But then there's only the slightest difference between what makes us cry out in horror and what makes us cry out in hilarity. If you're watching an episode of Bugs Bunny and Bugs Bunny whacks Daffy Duck with a sledgehammer, you laugh. If Leatherface smashes some teenager's face in with a sledgehammer, you scream. But you are responding to the same fundamental scene. Every joke has in it a germ of horror. Every horrific situation has some thread of existential comedy in it. I leave it to the folk in this room to puzzle that one out. For myself, it is enough to know that if it made anyone laugh, it'll make them shriek as well. All I have to do is figure out how to give it the right twist to make something goofy into something gory. And does horror still scare me? Did it ever? Yes and yes. Now, I may laugh at a good jump scare, but that doesn't mean I didn't also almost leap from my seat. I'm always glad to see a horror film or read a horror novel that gets to me, that rushes me into darkness to face one shock after another. It's such a nice thing not to be bitten in half, and horror stories never let me forget that. Horror fiction, which obsesses over death and decay and slaughter, inevitably awakens one to the exquisite thrill of being alive, a thing you can only enjoy for a handful of days and which can end at any moment. The creature could reach out from under the bed to grab you by the ankle at any time. Will it be tonight? Will it be waiting for you when you get back to your hotel room, breathing wetly, drool running from the rotted hole that used to be its mouth? He hasn't got you yet, and barring catastrophe, we'll all still be here tomorrow. If you're fortunate, the night will pass once again, and daylight will arrive, as it has on all the other days of your life. That's something to look forward to, and horror fans know it. Aren't we the lucky ones? Thanks.